Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 89 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is South African author and filmmaker Lauren Beukes. Her novels include Zoo City and Moxieland, and she also wrote a story arc for the graphic novel series Fairest, a spin-off of Bill Willingham's Fables. Her latest novel, The Shining Girls, about a time-traveling serial killer, has been optioned for TV by Leonardo DiCaprio's production company Appian Way.
Then stick around after the interview as guest geek Ross Lockhart joins us for a panel on psycho killers.
Alright, so let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Lauren Beukes. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Alright, so your new book is called The Shining Girls. So what's that about?
Well, it's about a time-traveling serial killer who is absolutely impossible to stop until one of his victims survives and turns the hunt around. It's set in Chicago between 1931 and 1993, and I specifically cut it off in 1993 so I could avoid the internet and Reddit and CCTV cameras and Google Earth and everything else, which would basically, wrap up the case in 2 days. But there's a violent drifter in 1931, Harper Curtis, who stumbles upon a house that opens onto other times. And what's really interesting about the house is that upstairs there is a wall in the bedroom, which is covered with these strange artifacts and girls' names that have been carved into the wall and written over and over and over again in his handwriting. And he knows that these are the Shining Girls and that he's going to have to go through time to find them and kill them. And he does this and is completely untraceable. His MO is all over the place. He's more violent in 1993 and less violent in 1984, which makes it impossible for any detective to try and put that together. Until Kirby survives the attack in 1989, and her life derails, and she becomes completely obsessed with finding the man who did this to her and stopping him.
Yeah, and you said that you got the idea from Twitter.
I got the idea on Twitter. I was messing around, as you do when you're supposed to be writing, and I threw it out in the middle of conversation. It was banter with a random stranger that I should write a book about a time-traveling serial killer, and I was like, no, wait, I really should. That would be amazing. I could do something really fun with that. I didn't want to do a Bill and Ted's excellent killing spree through time, killing Shakespeare, killing Hitler, killing, Prince Charles. I wanted to do something a bit more serious, I guess, because I like using fantastical elements in fiction to look at social issues. And I was very interested in the 20th century and specifically how much has changed in the 20th century, and in particular for women. So I immediately knew that I could not set the book in South Africa, just because the story of South Africa in the 20th century is the story of apartheid, and that would overshadow everything else that I wanted to talk about. And I kind of feel that I'm off the hook anyway, because both Moxieland and Zoo City, which are my previous novels, are kind of allegorical apartheids anyway. So I felt like I could get away with writing something different. And I started writing it on the plane. I quickly deleted the tweet because I didn't want anyone else to come across the idea. I think it's bad form to put your best ideas out there in the world. And I started writing it on the plane, and the story just came through very, very strongly. It starts with a man limping across the grass to a little girl in 1974, and he gives her an impossible present, which is a My Little Pony from 1982. And he tells her that he'll come back to get it. And he does, several years later, and tries to kill her.
And so time travel obviously is a favorite theme of science fiction writers and science fiction fans. So just what are some of the main things that you have to keep in mind when you're writing a time travel story?
I think it's really important to have a time travel story that makes sense. It's fine to have loops and paradoxes. It's time travel. That's part of the nature of the beast. But I wanted to play with, I guess, Greek tragedy time travel. Where your destiny is laid in stone, everything you try to do to resist it just kind of puts in motion everything that will bring it about. So very kind of Oedipus or Macbeth. But it's also kind of Sisyphus or Prometheus. That kind of stuck in a loop where you come back and are forced to repeat the same actions again and again and again. And it was really fun to play with that. I had to map it all out very, very carefully. Because Harper's MO is all over the place, he's jumping through time, killing women out of time. And I have a murder wall above my desk which tracks all the different timelines. There's Harper's killing timeline, there's the actual historical timeline of the murders, and then there's the novel's timeline, which jumps between the different young women's perspectives, Kirby the survivor's perspective, Harper's perspective, Kirby's sidekick Dan, and crisscrossing all of this are these red threads tracking the murders, black threads to track the objects that he leaves behind on the girls, yellow threads to track the objects that he takes from the girls, and all the reference pictures that I took on my research trip to Chicago. But it was very, very important to me that everything did make sense, that there wasn't kind of throwaway explanations, that if you concentrate and track it out, everything will hold together.
Mm. And if people want to see the picture of Lauren in front of her murder wall, that'll be the picture on our blog post, so you can go check that out. But it really does make it look like you're a serial killer. Did you ever worry that people would come over to your house and just think maybe you were a serial killer?
Well, a lot of people have asked my husband what it's like to be in bed with me at night, and makes me a bit worried. And he says, well, I think she gets most of it out on the page, so he's okay. But yeah, it looks like I'm a crazy person. I look completely nuts. I'm either clearly a serial killer or some kind of wannabe Homeland, The Wire detective, which is probably true. I actually would love to be a detective in The Wire. If I could step into any universe, it would be pattern recognition, Narnia, or The Wire.
Well, so, I mean, what was it about the idea of a serial killer that made you want to base a book around it?
I don't have a particular interest in serial killers. I'm not a fundy, I'm not a junkie. I have enjoyed serial killer movies like Zodiac or Silence of the Lambs, obviously, Seven. And I think when you do it cleverly, it's very interesting. But I think often serial killers are represented in popular culture as these sexy, glamorous, sophisticated apex predators who are sipping Chianti while diabolically planning out attacks, messing with the detectives' minds, and actually doing a lot of research into real serial killers and true crime, which was absolutely the most devastating part of writing the book, just having to actually delve into these people's heads. There's not a lot going on in there. They generally don't have a lot of empathy, obviously, but they also don't have a lot of insight into why they're doing what they're doing. And a lot of them have major issues with impotence in the world, whether that's actual sexual dysfunction or feelings of powerlessness. And they're actually just violent losers. And that's not as interesting as Hannibal, but I thought I could make it interesting through this book to actually portray a serial killer as they often truly are. And to make it much more about the victims, to focus on the shining girls. And I think coming from South Africa, which has a terrible femicide rate, and having seen a family very close to me suffer terribly through the murder of their 23-year-old daughter, and the way the police bungled the case. If there's a murder reported in the news, there was real horror and there was real violence there.
Well, I mean, maybe could you say a bit more about this real-life case you were involved in? How did you get involved in that, and why did things go so wrong with the investigation and the aftermath?
I have a cleaning lady who comes to my house once a week, and her 23-year-old daughter, who I'd known since she was 14 or 15, was murdered by her boyfriend. So her name was Tomokazi Zazuyokwe, and her boyfriend, who'd been abusive and had beaten her up in the past, locked her in the shack. He stabbed her, he poured boiling water over her head, and then he walked away. And 5 days later, the neighbors, responding to the moaning, got the police to come in and break down the door. And it was horrific, as you can imagine. And she was rushed to hospital, and she had third-degree burns. They'd become infected. There were flies thick on her skin. She was in absolute agony. And she was in and out of hospital over the next 4 months. And the family didn't know that they had recourse. They didn't know what their rights were. They were poor and black. And I tried to help them as much as I could. I took them to the Women's Legal Center and tried to get them legal counsel. I tried to get the records from the hospitals. But it's like China Miéville's The City in the City. We live in parallel universes. If you're middle class or above, you have more rights. And you have more recourse to justice and to medicine and to everything. And it was devastating to see that. But it was especially devastating when I went with Tomokazi's sister to the court case. And we saw the guy there with his new 19-year-old girlfriend outside, because you're on the bench with the same people that you're actually going to be testifying against. And the prosecutor called us into the office and he told us that he couldn't prosecute the case because he showed us the one piece of paper that was the police record. And he was like, this is the worst bit of investigating I've ever seen. The only person they bothered to interview is the victim and she's dead. So this guy can stand up in court and he can say absolutely anything he wants. And he will get away with it. And I will have to believe him because I have no evidence to the contrary. And he's like, I'm going to throw it out of court now, but you can reopen the case. You can go back to the police. You can appeal to the justice minister and maybe the newspaper, see what you can do. And I just burst into tears in the middle of his office. And I'm not really one who's prone to that kind of thing, but I was so angry. I was so angry that this guy was going to get away with this. And that there wasn't justice and that the system didn't work. And you're raised on all these fairy tales of American TV shows where it does work. And Matlock and Murder, She Wrote and, NYPD Blue and all of that stuff. And it wasn't real. So I managed to get the case reopened. I got it into all the major newspapers because I'm middle class and I have a voice and I know how to use it and I have friends who are journalists. And it was widely covered and the family phoned me a week later. And this was now 4 months after she died. And they said to me, we can't face going through it again. We want you to let it go. And it was very, very hard for me to let it go. But it wasn't my decision to make and it wasn't my fight to have. So I did. And I guess this novel is in part a way of exorcising that, but also just generally the terrible violence against women and men that we see in society. I think another classic example is what's recently happened in South Africa with our Paralympian athlete Oscar Pistorius, who murdered his girlfriend Ria Steenkamp. And all the publicity and press has been about him. And she's nothing but a pretty corpse. And I wanted to write a book which was about real women and not about pretty corpses.
Mm. Well, could you talk about how you did that? Because, this is a book that it pays much more attention to the victims than crime books typically do.
Absolutely. So I wanted to, serial killers often have a type, although I believe there's now research which says that that's not true. But, there are always contradictory studies at any time. Today caffeine's good for you and tomorrow it's bad for you. I'm going to hold with caffeine being good for you. So serial killers generally have a type. Ted Bundy was into a young woman with brown hair and a middle parting, for example. And I thought, okay, what if Harper's type was actually not physical, but something within the girls, some burning potential, some fire inside them? What if he was like a twisted Prometheus, where he is going to try and steal their fire to try and fill the hollowness inside himself? And they're all, there's a range of different characters, from a young architect in the 1950s who's accused of being a dirty commie, to a burlesque dancer with a terrible secret, to an activist working in the 1970s providing backstreet abortions safely and humanely to women in desperate need, through to a young woman who dances in radium paint, which is actually based on a real young woman I discovered in my research, who was in hospital for radiation burns because you really should not dance in radium paint. An artist and a cross curvy who really only starts to shine after she's been attacked. And it was really important to me to be able to explore their lives in detail. There's also an African-American welder. And they're all kicking back against their context in some time. They're all extraordinary in, I guess, normal ways. It's not like any of them are going to grow up to be the next president of the United States, or that the economic student, for example, is going to stop the 2008 crash if only she'd lived. But they're all going to make some kind of contribution. They're curious and engaged and smart and full of fire. So most of the chapter is actually about their lives and who they are and their ambitions and hopes and fears and where they're going. And right at the end, Harper comes for them. And it's written from their perspectives. The attack is not written from Harper's perspective, where you're kind of on his shoulder, accompanying him along for the ride, getting off on the same kind of twisted, sick thrills that he is. You're with the victim, and she is afraid, and she is angry and outraged and, hopeless and can't believe that this is happening to her. So it's much more about the emotion of that moment. And I think that's, a lot of people have reacted very strongly to the violence in the book. And I think it's because I made it emotional, or I'd like to think that, and that it's not gratuitous. I specifically have tried to avoid writing torture porn, and actually my editor is one of the leading experts in violence against women in South Africa. So if she said a scene was okay and passed muster, I felt like it was probably okay.
Well, yeah, could you talk a little bit about your research method? How did you research these characters and their time periods?
The research was really fun on this book. I was working with two young researchers, Adam Maxwell in Denver, Colorado, and Zara Trafford in South Africa. And mainly they were dealing with the nitty-gritty stuff. So I would ask Adam, for example, for details on a 1931 hospital. Because the way I deal with my serial killer, he's just the most awful human being. And the only way I could deal with writing him was to just fuck him up at every opportunity. So I rip his tendon, I break his jaw, I get him bitten by a dog, I get him stung by a bee. You know, it's the little victories which count. But that meant I had to keep track of all his injuries. But I also had to know how you would treat those injuries in the 1930s, because he always returns to 1931, which is his home base. So I asked Adam Maxwell, my researcher, to look into the nitty-gritty details, like what does a 1931 hospital look like? How much would they charge? How would they fix a ripped tendon? What would the doctors wear? You know, how is the Great Depression affecting hospital wards at that time? You know, all that kind of stuff. And he sent me back a whole ton of information with links to everything from, you know, oral history reports about hospitals at that time, to photographs of what doctors were wearing, through to links to eBay if I wanted to buy creepy medical equipment from the 1930s. Which I really, really don't. But anyway, it was fun to have that. And then he sent me this article that he found from 1936 from the Milwaukee Sentinel about a young woman who was dancing to her death in radium paint. And it was about this burlesque dancer who danced in radioactive paint and what this was doing to her. And the article was just so amazing. And it was full of this really rich, descriptive language. And she speaks in this crazy French accent. She says, "Oh, tell the boys they should not be frightened of me. They should be frightened of the radiation. But it is that which is poisonous." I should probably never do a French accent. But I also went back to Chicago. I'd lived in Chicago in 2000, 2001. And I went back on a research trip and I interviewed a police detective to find out what access to the case Kirby would have had. We went through boxes of old evidence files, which was just completely crazy. And I took lots of photographs. I interviewed an old Chicago Sun-Times journalist. I interviewed musicians from the 90s who were very involved in the punk scenes. I interviewed the head of the zine museum, because Kirby starts writing for the zines, which were obviously a big part of the 90s punk scene as well. A Chicago historian who fact-checked everything for me and triple-checked it. He was amazing. And I went on location scouts. I went to Montrose Beach, which is where Kirby's attack happens, and I kind of choreographed it. Yeah, I snuck around through the back corridors of the Congress Hotel with a ghost hunter and, really just got a feel for the city and the different time periods. And I think this comes from having been a journalist. You find that the real amazing details are actually in the real world. And if you can hang your fantastic fiction on those real details, it makes it more credible. It makes it more believable.
Mm-hmm. One thing I heard you say I thought was funny was you said that when you were interviewing people to be your research assistants, and Adam said something like he named his company after one of your books or something, and that helped him get the job.
Yeah, totally. This, again, Twitter is amazing. I advertised for the position of research assistant on Twitter, and both of my researchers came from there. And Adam approached me. His Twitter name is @SnipeHunter. And he'd actually named his company Skyward Star. It's a game development company. And Skyward Star is a character in Moxieland. And it was amazing to have someone who knew me and knew my work working with me and knowing what I was interested in. And that's exactly why he kicked up that article on the Radium Girl for me. He had some understanding of how my mind works and what I would find interesting. So that was incredibly valuable. I mean, I also asked Twitter for all kinds of things about, I got one thing wrong, which luckily one of my editors caught. I'm sure people are going to find other mistakes, but I'm 99% sure we got most of them covered. But there's one timeline mistake where Zora, the African-American welder, is a little bit too young in one scene, and I had to age her up. And in the original scene, she was playing with a truck, and when I aged her up, she was making paper planes for her little brother. And I was like, wait, did they even have paper planes in 1932? And I Googled and I went through about 5 pages of search results and I couldn't find anything. So I asked Twitter. And within 5 minutes, somebody had responded with a Daily Mail article about paper darts recovered from the eaves of a chapel in 1899, or which dated back to 1899. So it was really, the hive mind is phenomenal.
So is the protagonist Kirby, is that named after Jack Kirby or Kirby the video game character or anything like that?
Well, obviously, I think there are those pop culture resonances. And, building research and building a convincing time period absolutely relies on getting the pop culture right. The advertising and the music and the movies and everything that was happening at that time. But no, Kirby's name was actually inspired by a real-life Kirby I met, who happens to be @thebestkirby on Twitter. And I met her years ago. She was the sister, she is the sister of somebody who interned for me. And I was like, that's it. I'm stealing your sister's name. I hope you realize that. I'm totally using her name. I'm saving that for the right character. And when she comes along, that's it.
I heard you say that part of your research involved listening to podcasts. I was just wondering which podcasts are the best for your purposes.
Oh, I can't remember the name of the true crime podcast I was listening to. I would have to look it up. I'll probably do that. Hang on. Here we go. True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and authors that have written about them. And actually, that was found for me by my South African cover designer, Joey Hi-Fi. He does have a major interest in serial killers, and because he's a designer, he listens to a lot of podcasts while he's working. I can't do that because I can't compete with the words in my head. But he found a lot of really, really great stuff for me.
And I heard you say that serial killers are fond of puns.
Yes, I was hanging out with Ed Brubaker in Los Angeles. He's the most amazing. I think he's definitely one of my favorite comics writers. And his series Criminal is just impeccable. It's the most beautiful storytelling. It's the first time I've ever actually stopped after I've read something and had to Google the hell out of someone to find out just who this guy is. Who could this person be who could write this story? And we made friends on Twitter. I sent him a copy of my book. Again, Twitter. And we hooked up in LA. And I went out for dinner with him and his wife and another friend of theirs. And they were driving me home, and he was telling me that a profiler friend of his had told him that serial killers apparently are really into puns. And it's kind of one of the senses of humor that they that they can kind of understand, and that they use to show that they do have empathy and a sense of humor. So if you like puns, you might have some latent tendencies.
I actually don't. Actually, puns kind of make me want to kill people, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That too.
Well, I thought it was interesting that, you do so much research and you read all this true crime and so on, but you also said that you don't watch the news. It's just kind of an interesting paradox almost.
It is. I think I find the news often very depressing and often very local. And, it's really irritating that CNN, like my novel, loops back on itself within 15 minutes. At least my novel gets like 400 pages. And it's just crazy. And there's so much of the world that we're missing out on. And I find Twitter is a much more interesting and diverse way of actually connecting with the world. And then I can follow up on the stories that I'm interested in. Of course, the problem is that you're creating an echo chamber, which is only feeding you the news that you want to hear. But I think I have fairly broad tastes, and I follow some really interesting curators who do tweet a lot of interesting stuff about the world. So I feel like I do have a better sense of the world from Twitter than I would if I was actually watching the news.
So you just got back from your book tour for this book. Could you just talk about what sort of reactions are you getting to the book from readers and just people you talk to?
It's been amazing. I had Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl, and of course the book keeps getting compared to Gone Girl, but she actually wrote a review in O Magazine that she really enjoyed it, and that she actually knew me from my comics work, which just blew my mind. Obviously I have other writer friends who've really liked it. William Gibson loved it, and Richard Cadre. Tana French, who I've never met, had a really good response to it. She said it scared the bejesus out of her, which was really gratifying. It's good to scare the bejesus out of Tana French. But just people's reactions have been generally very positive. There have been some people who find the violence very hectic, and some people who accuse me of it being gratuitous, which is the one criticism which really cuts me deep, as it were. Because I really tried very hard not to make it so. The other interesting thing was I actually had a young woman wait until the very end at my New York signing to come up and talk to me. And she didn't say so outright, but she implied that something bad had happened to her, and that she said she expected the book to affect her, but she hadn't expected it to cut so deep. And she said thank you. And I think out of all the responses I've had, that meant the most to me. That I am actually speaking somehow to the survivor's experience in a meaningful way that resonates with them.
Have you ever had any funny experiences on this past tour or any of your previous book tours?
I had the one guy who came up to me at a con and said, your hair is looking much better today. I was like, thanks, random stranger. That's great. I don't know. Not in particular. I've met really amazing people, and demanded that people take me out for drinks. And yeah, I ended up going back to the hotel in Houston, and I went back onto Twitter and found one of the women I'd met at the reading. And I tweeted at her and I was like, are you still in the area? Please come pick me up and take me for a drink. I'm bored and lonely. And she did. And it was amazing. So again, power of Twitter. It's phenomenal.
All right. And so it was just recently announced that there's going to be a TV adaptation of The Shining Girls. You want to tell us about that?
The Shining Girls has been optioned by Appian Way, which is Leonardo DiCaprio's company, and MRC, who made House of Cards, which was directed by David Fincher and starred Kevin Spacey. And very interestingly, and I think this is what sold me on them, went straight to Netflix. And MRC has a very interesting funding model, which isn't based on making a pilot. It's based on finding the right people and getting the right script. And then if that works out, there all systems go. And when I was looking at the different options, because we had 4 different companies pitching on the book, and some wanted to make a TV series and some wanted to make a movie, and it really came down to that, the fact that they were so forward thinking, and that really feels like the future of television. You know, I was riding in the car with my 4-year-old this morning, taking her to school, and one of the songs from Wreck-It Ralph came on the radio, and she demanded that I play it again. And I couldn't explain to her that radio was not on demand. And she has no concept of media which is not on demand. And that's absolutely the way we're heading, you know, and to think otherwise is very foolish. And there's a reason Game of Thrones is the most pirated TV show on earth. And if HBO would just make it possible for people to buy it, I think it would change a lot. And, you know, it would change those statistics massively. There would still obviously be pirates, but I think there are a lot of people who want to pay for that kind of content who can't have any, you know, who just don't have any access to it. So I was excited about about them as a prospective partner in that regard. And also the fact that, you know, they sold me on the idea of a TV series to think of it as a 13-hour movie, which would really allow you to get very deeply into the characters, because otherwise you run the risk of the girls really just being pretty corpses. You know, you would just get such a short snapshot of their lives in like 2 hours that they might be reduced to exactly what I was trying to avoid.
Mm. So you're saying they're not going to do a pilot, they're going straight to series, and it's going to be on Netflix, or? No.
I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that's
Okay.
what they've done previously.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how it's going to work. The ink is barely dry on the paper. So they're going to try and attach a director and, you know, and then try and find a really great scriptwriter. But they don't spend money making a pilot. You know, I mean, HBO has, you know, everyone makes pilots for HBO. And then they see if they'll pick up the pilot, and then you end up with crazy stuff like polar bears in an episode, which are never explained and never make sense ever again. And you're kind of stuck with it. So they're much more about running a really, really strong script, getting great talent attached, and then raising the money based on that, rather than messing around trying to make a pilot which you're then stuck with. But I might be misrepresenting their business model. That's my understanding of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a background in TV and film. Do you expect to be involved at all with the production?
I am on board as a consultant. We'll see, you know, it really depends on the director and how much input they need. I'd love to be involved. I don't have any illusions that, you know, it's an adaptation. It's a completely different animal. And it also it becomes a collaborative vision that's no longer mine. And that's absolutely fine.
All right. Well, and speaking of TV, I thought it was funny. You said that growing up that you weren't allowed to watch V, or it was difficult for you to watch the TV show V in South Africa. So
during apartheid, there was a lot of censorship. You know, it's the one way that an evil, dictatorial, racist regime can maintain power is by keeping people in the dark as to what's actually going on. And they took it to crazy lengths. You know, like sometimes defiant newspaper editors would put out a newspaper with a blank front page, or a front page just covered with kind of black censor bars to show how much they were being censored. And the kind of footage that the rest of the world saw, you know, on TV, on the news, we weren't exposed to. We weren't seeing the same kind of violence and, you know, the craziness in the townships and activists being killed. It was really super restricted. But this went to just ridiculous lengths. And the TV series V came on late 80s, early 90s. And it's a mini-series, and the first episode aired. And I was really excited because it was science fiction and there were aliens and it was really cool. And next thing I know, it's been pushed to a really, really late time slot. You know, it was kind of Fridays, 7 p.m., and suddenly it got moved to Wednesdays at 11:30, which meant because I was a school kid that I couldn't really stay up and watch it. And I asked my parents why, and they were like, well, you see, it's because they've got freedom fighters, and freedom fighters is a bad word that the government doesn't like. My parents were very liberal. I was very lucky to grow up with liberal parents who did not believe in the racist regime. But that was the explanation I got, and I only found out years later that the real reason it got pushed to such a late time slot where no one could see it was because the state president, whose nickname was the Big Crocodile, had freaked out completely, phoned the head of the SABC that night after the first episode had aired and demanded that it be taken off air immediately because the aliens were actually reptiles. And he was so vain that he thought this TV show was actually about him. And it was just, I mean, it was the whole apartheid regime was terrible, and we're going to be tripping up over its legacy for years and years and years to come. There's no easy fix to what happened in this country. And it was devastating, and people were killed, and there were, apartheid assassination squads and death camps and a chemical weapons program that was trying to make black people sterile. And it was horrific. But every dictatorship also has its just ridiculous eccentricities. And that was an example of one of them. Just this absolutely absurd moment amongst all the craziness.
So did that extend outside of television to written science fiction as well? I mean, what has the written science fiction scene been like in South Africa for the past few decades?
Well, interestingly, James Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians is about a kind of totalitarian regime and the futility of it and the absurdity of it. And it's very much a science fictional novel. It came out in the 80s. And the apartheid government absolutely missed the allegory there. They banned other stupid things. Like they actually banned the book Black Beauty about the horse because it had the words Black Beauty. And they were like, no, we can't have black people thinking that way. That's just, those two words in combination. That's terrible. And I read some Afrikaans literature at the time, which was very much allegorical about the revolution in Ireland, for example. And it was, South African writers found ways of talking about apartheid without writing about it directly, because that would get you banned, or at worst exiled, or, a lot of people were put under house arrest. It was a really shocking time. So there was some very early science fiction which kind of was allegorical at the time. And then the apartheid ended, and to generalize terribly, everything was post-apartheid stories, or I grew up under apartheid memoirs, and we were struggling to find our feet kind of as a literature, I think. And it's only been in the past maybe 5 to 7 years that the scene's really opened up much more, and that people are really open to, publishers are open to fiction which strays from, either apartheid memoirs or very straight contemporary fiction which addresses current issues of what it means to be South African, and to just let people play. And the science fiction scene is really exploding now, and that's really exciting. And I think it started with District 9, and then when Zoo City won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, I think it just showed people that it was possible to write that kind of story and that there was an audience for it. And there's some very exciting stuff happening at the moment. I mentored a young writer, Charlie Human, whose book Apocalypse Now is coming out in July, and it's just mental. It's just this crazy, batshit, amazing, wonderful urban fantasy set in Cape Town. With lots of magic, but also some apartheid stuff. And it's just absolutely fascinating. Sarah Lotz is making huge waves. She's got a major thriller coming out next year, but she's been writing very interesting, very nuanced horror as S.L. Gray together with Louis Greenberg, looking at consumerism and hospitals and education, but in a really fun, dark, creepy way with this kind of alternate, underworld.
And are there science fiction conventions and magazines and workshops and stuff like that in South Africa?
There's some small magazines. Science Fiction South Africa, there's Something Wicked magazine. Jungle Gym is a wonderful pulp magazine. There's some interesting stuff happening online. Bloody Parchment puts together horror anthologies and has an annual competition. But it's all very small, and very few people are actually making a real living out of it. It's certainly not the same status as it is in the States or even in the UK.
You mentioned District 9, Neil Blomkamp. What do you think about his upcoming movie, Elysium?
I have avoided all the trailers because I'm dying to see it. And I think it's going to be amazing. And I love the way that he brings his South African perspective to bear on bigger issues. It's very, very exciting. And he said that he's based it on, veterans from Angola. And also, it's a divided society. The rich live up in space. And it's just absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to see it. I've avoided the trailers because I don't want any spoilers. I want to go into it absolutely cold, not knowing anything about it. And what I think is amazing about Neil Blomkamp and South African genre fiction in general is how he brings together that he takes a major issue, and by making it science fictional, putting this fantastic spin on it, it gives you a new way of seeing it and a new way of talking about it. If District 9 had just been about refugees, it would have been Hotel Rwanda. And if it had just been about aliens, it would have been Battlefield Earth, probably directed by Michael Bay. And the fact that he brought those two things together was what made it so exciting. And I think that's what a lot of genre fiction in South Africa is doing, is just twisting reality slightly so that we can get a fresh perspective on it, especially tired issues like xenophobia or, violence against women or stratified society and kind of neo-apartheid systems based on economics.
I mean, have there been other filmmakers coming out of South Africa sort of picking up the torch after Neil Blomkamp?
They're trying. I think it helps to have a personal relationship with Peter Jackson. Because obviously Neil Blomkamp was very much his protege. And it's very hard to get a movie made in this country, especially if you're talking about big special effects. Neil Blomkamp I think he's an outlier. He was an amazing animator doing incredible stuff. If you look at his original short, Alive in Joburg, it's just phenomenal. And all the foundation for District 9 was already there. And he probably could have made it by himself, actually, using his animation skills. But the fact that he was able to tie in with Peter Jackson, the fact that the Halo movie fell through and that he was able to do his own project, I think was actually the best thing that could have happened to him. I think it's also, it's a hard thing to follow up on. You can't say, okay, I'm just going to do what Neil Blomkamp did. You have to have all those factors. It's about hard work and determination, but so much of it is also about pure bloody luck.
Well, and we mentioned that you yourself have a background in both animation and directing. One thing I thought was interesting was that in The Shining Girls, there's a character who's a transgender character who hides the fact that she has a male body and works as a sort of a burlesque dancer. And you did a documentary called Glitter Boys and Ganglands, and I was just wondering if that helped inspire that character at all.
The documentary definitely helped inspire that character. Spending time with the girls really just gave me a real feel for what they go through. And, the everyday issues that they have to tackle. And, the other interesting thing is I've always used my journalism and my other work to feed into my fiction. With Zoo City, I used a lot of previous journalism that I'd done on 419 scammers, for example, or rehab safaris where people come to South Africa for cheap rehab because it costs 25,000 Rand in South Africa and it's $25,000 in the US. And I just kind of threaded that through the narrative. You can actually draw a pretty direct line between The Shining Girls and my first book, which is a non-fiction, Maverick, Extraordinary Woman from South Africa's Past, which is all short chapters about extraordinary women who had to deal with hardship in their lives and fighting against their social context and were often dogged by terrible tragedy, but also fought through. And those were real historical women. So I think that set a precedent, and that was absolutely kind of partly where this book was coming from.
I don't know if you ever played the Rift pen and paper role-playing game. It's the science fiction game, but it just made me think of it because they have these characters named Glitter Boys, and they're... Do you know what I'm talking about?
I never played it, but that's cool.
Oh, yeah, so the Glitter Boys are these gigantic robot, power armor suits with sort of diamond armor that deflects laser beams, and they have these gigantic rail guns that are so powerful that when you shoot them, you have to have these pylons shoot 15 feet into the ground out of your boots to brace you from the recoil. So
that is amazing.
I just thought,
awesome.
Since you like Glitter Boys, I thought maybe you would like to make a documentary about that, maybe next.
I would totally like to make a documentary about that. That sounds incredible. Have you got a mech suit? I'm all about giant robots.
Well, I'm sure John, my co-host John Joseph Adams, would want us to mention, speaking of mech suits, his anthology Armored that you contributed a story to. You want to talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah, John asked me to write a story about it. And I played Mech Warrior when I was a kid, and giant robots are cool, and Robotech was like one of my formative influences, especially the way they just killed characters, way before George R.R. Martin was doing it. It was a kid's cartoon, they were killing characters, it was amazing. Yeah, so I was really excited to write, a story about a power suit or a mecha, but I wanted to do a really dark twist on it, and it's actually a company that comes from Moxieland, Initech Biologica, have established a space operation that's specifically harvesting new forms of organic life to synthesize as drugs or medication, which of course is something we're seeing happening in the real world now. And something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. And there are dead soldiers who are being kept alive by this really creepy algae. And they're kind of half dead, half alive inside the suits. And it's when harvesters mission to try and confront what's going on and find out the truth, the terrible, terrible truth.
And then John was just telling me that you also have a story coming up in his Wastelands 2 anthology.
Yeah, Chiselhurst Messiah. It was partly inspired by the London riots. Although I don't watch the news, I do keep abreast of it. And it was very interesting actually being in London just after that happened, because we'd seen so much hectic footage on TV. And the South African ambassador had actually issued a warning advising South African citizens not to travel to London. So I'm in London and I'm kind of tiptoeing around and I'm texting my friends saying, where is it safe to go? And they're just laughing at me because the London riots were terrible, but they had also been blown out of proportion the same way South African crime always gets blown out of proportion. And it was really interesting to be on the other side of that, to be the scared tourist, as opposed to the local who's just like, oh God, really? Really? Is it, do you really feel that way? But yeah, Chiselhurst Messiah is about a rich man who thinks he's the last human alive. And then he starts finding YouTube videos about the survivors. And he thinks that he must be the one to save them. He realizes he's the only one over 35 and that he must surely bring his wisdom to the people and help them. And sets out to do exactly that. And of course, things devolve horribly from there.
All right, cool. So do you have any other projects you want to mention? I mean, you have all sorts of stuff going on. It's almost too much to keep track of. Graphic novels and screenplays and everything.
Well, my graphic novel, Fairest, The Hidden Kingdom, which is a spin-off of Fables. It's a J-horror Rapunzel. It's coming out in July. I figured that Rapunzel's all about the hair, and Japanese horror is all about the hair, and this can't be a coincidence. So I took Bill Willingham's characters from Fables, and he specifically asked me to pitch on Rapunzel and what I would do with her. And I took her to Japan and was able to really kind of explore all the Japanese fairy tales. And again, do a ton of research into how the Yakuza work and the different kind of yokai. And, I made the artist that I was working with, Inaki Miranda, who's just phenomenal. But I made him watch like 5 videos on pachinko for one page, just so that he could draw the pachinko parlor right, and so that we could get the authenticity of it down. Because you know what? I read a comic a while ago, which is set, the characters fly to Cape Town. And if you do one Google image search on Cape Town, you will see an amazing, bright, beautiful, cosmopolitan city in front of Table Mountain. And the artist had drawn generic street scenes and an airport which looked like it was in rural Rwanda. It was long grass and wildebeest. And I was like, no, seriously, please, we have a major international airport. We are a vibrant, amazing city. Please don't do this. So I think that's partly why I'm so obsessed with getting the detail right. I want locals to be able to read my work and say, yeah, she did a pretty good job. But yeah, and then my new project is Broken Monsters, which is set in Detroit. It's about weird bodies turning up in kind of abandoned places, and a police detective who's trying to investigate it and her relationship with her daughter. And that's coming out next year.
And you're also doing a screenplay adaptation of Zoo City, right?
I am. That's on hold at the moment because I have to finish the novel. But it's been really fun to revisit that universe, and it really makes me feel like I would like to do a sequel at some point. It's also been amazing because an adaptation is naturally a different animal. It has to be, because it has to be more visual. And to mess with the story a little bit the core story has stayed the same, but to rearrange the scenes, to bring through the relationship between Zinzi and Benoit much more strongly so that he's more present throughout, and figuring out how to represent the email scams was all really, really fun. And there's actually stuff that I've put into the screenplay that I kind of almost wish I could go back and put into the book. So it's worked out pretty well. Well, it's a long, slow process developing something as a feature film. It might take 4 to 10 years. We'll see. Hopefully 4. But, yeah. Raising that pesky $30 million. It's just such a pain in the ass. If you know anyone who has $30 million, please send them my way.
Well, I'm sure one of our listeners probably has $30 million.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
definitely.
Yeah. It's all taken care of. Now that you've been on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, all your problems are over.
Fantastic.
All right, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Lauren Beukes. Her new book is called The Shining Girls. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been awesome, David.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Lauren Beukes for joining us on the show. And as we mentioned for our panel today, we'll be discussing Psycho Killers. and we're joined by a special guest geek, Ross Lockhart. He's the author of the rock and roll novel Chick Bassist, and has edited dozens of books, including the anthologies The Book of Cthulhu and the upcoming Tales of Jack the Ripper. So Ross, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
And so just a quick note, I want to define, first of all, what we mean by psycho killers, because you might say pretty much all killers are psycho, right? But for purposes of this discussion, a psycho killer can't be someone who's getting paid, like a mercenary or a gangster or an assassin or something. They have to be in it for the love, and they have to target more or less ordinary people. And so these psycho killers that had the biggest impact on me when I was a kid, that were sort of in pop culture the most, were Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street movie series and Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th movie series. And they really had a big impact on me, even though I was way too scared to watch any of the movies. And I don't even know how I even really knew what Freddy Krueger even looked like. I think just people must have talked about him, or I saw a poster, or the box at the video store or something. But even that was enough to terrify me. And the house that I grew up in, we sort of had a finished basement, and then you opened a door into the laundry room, and then you opened a door kind of into the cellar. And in my nightmares, I would be down there. And rather than just those 3 little rooms, it was this endless labyrinth of caverns. And Freddy Krueger would be chasing me through them. And and that's even without having seen any of those movies. So I can only imagine what sort of nightmares I might have had if I had actually watched any of those movies. But, I mean, John, I know that you're impervious to fear,
yes.
So I won't even ask you about this. But Ross, did you ever have nightmares like that? Which psycho killers sort of scared you the most or had the most impact on you when you were young?
It wasn't the fictional ones that I found scary so much as the real ones. I did have a fascination with Hitchcock's Psycho, which led me back to Robert Bloch, and that whole idea that the killer could be the boy next door, I've long found appealing. But coming of age in the 70s and 80s, it was very much a serial killer culture at large. You had Manson in prison constantly showing up on TV, and then larger-than-life characters like Richard Ramirez, who just recently died in prison, and such that were constantly on the news.
Okay, so John, I guess I will ask you, do you have an answer to this question?
Yeah, I may be impervious to fear now, Dave, but when I was a kid, I wasn't. I was much less rational back then. I was struggling with religious beliefs and all that kind of stuff, and so I was much more prone to being terrified by such things. And actually, I will say the one thing that has always scared me was this notion that if you die in a dream, that you would die in real life. That thought sort of got into my head, and so like Freddy always did kind of scare me because of that possibility. And although like you, I can't say that I really watched these movies when I was a kid. I mean, maybe I saw like Nightmare on Elm Street when I was a teenager. And, I basically know nothing about Friday the 13th, or anything I do know about Friday the 13th is just because of pop culture. And also there was like a Nintendo video game, based on Friday the 13th that I actually played quite a bit, which was, I remember being pretty good, but, I basically know nothing about it, except, like I said, from pop culture.
But, Ross, you mentioned watching Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and I think you said that you just rewatched that, right? Did you, do you have any, impressions of it just from rewatching it so recently?
The performances are so understated and so much more realistic feeling than I think a lot of contemporary acting is. Hitchcock really had a great way of coaxing naturalistic performances out of his actors, even when they were being a little more over the top. You've got Norman dressing up as his mother and such. Big spoiler. But it feels smart and it feels realistic. And the big change from Bloch's novel to the film, moving your POV character to Marion Crane for the film, and following her for a good half hour, thinking that she's going to be the protagonist of this film when she is suddenly murdered in a shower, is one of the most mind-blowing moments in modern cinema.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just this great fake out of that she's stolen this large sum of money, and you assume that the violence in the movie is going to be people fighting over this money somehow. And then, nope, she just ran into this psycho guy. And, the money had nothing to do with it. I don't know if you guys saw the recent movie Hitchcock, which is a biopic about the making of Psycho. Actually, the thing about that movie that struck me the most is that Hitchcock, at least as depicted in this movie, got so much pushback that nobody at the studio wanted him to make this movie that was just thought of as just being just grotesque and sick and tasteless. Mm-hmm. And he was adamant. And I think he took out a second mortgage on his house or something to help finance it when they wouldn't.
Yeah, it's not surprising that he ran into a lot of pushback on making that movie. I mean, you think about like the time it was made. I mean, oh my God, like how revolutionary was that movie when it came out? I can't imagine that there was a lot that could have even possibly compared to it at the time.
Like there was a remake of Psycho starring Vince Vaughn, I think back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And of course, just recently there's this Bates Motel TV series. Mm-hmm. Does anyone know anything about those?
I haven't caught the TV series, but I did enjoy the first Psycho sequel. There were, I think, 3 sequels, and the Psycho 2 was a lot of fun. The Gus Van Sant shot-for-shot remake is a really interesting piece of work, but it is appreciable merely as pastiche. He doesn't really add anything to it. The performances, it's just other actors in the roles, and it's kind of uncomfortable watching. I know it was critically slammed, but for me, it's one of those films that it literally doesn't feel like it has any reason to exist.
One of the reviews I read of the Gus Van Sant Psycho, it's one of the most memorable lines from a movie review that stuck in my mind, but it says, like Othello, Gus Van Sant loves Psycho, not wisely, but well.
I like that.
I don't think I even knew that there was a Psycho 2 or a Psycho 3. It seems to me that they missed a big opportunity there to have Psycho, Psycho-er, and Psycho-ist.
Well, this was the pre-Die Hard days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, now they might also go with the psychos for the second one, and then there would be 2 people.
Yeah.
Possibly a team, like in Scream. I was going to mention Scream when you were talking about the fake out scene at the beginning of Psycho, because in Scream they obviously riff on that directly right at the beginning. And I was just rewatching this in preparation for this panel, and my wife hadn't seen it before, and neither had my sister-in-law, and so we were all watching it together. And as far as they know, Drew Barrymore is one of the stars of the movie, and it's like, so the scene opened, the first scene has Drew Barrymore sort of having this encounter with the killer, and so like you suspect that, obviously she'll escape because this is like the first 5 minutes of the movie. And so it seemed like it was really powerful to them that that all of this happens just right. It's like in the prologue of the movie. It's like that's not even really the movie. It's like, that's like that character, she's dead by the end of the 5 minutes. And so it's like exactly like what Hitchcock did in Psycho. And that movie actually holds up really, really well, I think. A lot of these psycho killer type stories, there's a lot of contrivances that we just sort of allow just so that we can tell the story. And it's like Scream has a lot of those, but it works really, really well as a horror movie that comments on horror movies and also has a good mystery to it, And I think the killer in that is actually somebody, it's really interesting to watch because it's like, it kind of seems like maybe there's some sort of supernatural element to it, but you don't really know. And it turns out that it's just completely, it's completely realistic. It's just that, there's 2 guys that are, wearing this mask and killing people. And so that's why, they're able to seem like maybe, they're in more than one place at once, or that they move pretty naturally fast or whatever like that. So, I thought that was really interesting. What did you guys think about Scream?
Well, yeah, and it breaks the convention that, you think that if you've seen the masked attacker, and then you saw someone else, not the masked attacker, in the same scene, that person couldn't be the masked attacker, that you that's the assumption you have for any movie like that. And that totally, broke that whole thing by having
Right.
the killing team. But like you say, it's like some of the plausibility issues. It's like, how long does it take to like dress up as that psycho killer and like change out? Like, it's like his Superman like going into the telephone booth, like, and especially like if you're gonna kill someone, you don't need to wear you don't need to dress up to hide your identity, because presumably they'll be dead, after you finish killing them. But I guess the killer in Scream, he tends to have pretty bad aim with his knife. So
Yeah,
maybe
true.
It is good to have that disguise on in case you missed like 50 times with the knife and the person gets away.
Well, it also points to a sort of murder as fetish sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Murderer is not going to be able to get his rocks off unless he's wearing his costume. So
Yeah, I think it's sort of a Halloween thing, the not the holiday, but the movie, the Michael Myers thing. It's sort of like they obviously were super obsessed with horror movies, and that was part of the appeal of doing it at all, was was emulating their horror movie icons.
Well, the masked psycho is such a great archetype. It's a force. It's, to put it in the language of the movie Halloween, it's the shape that gets you. It's, not that it's a person. It is sort of a personification of death. And whether that is just the silently moving killer like Michael Myers in Halloween, or the wisecracking killer like a Freddy Krueger, we do seem drawn to this sort of death personified as something a little more understandable.
Mm-hmm. Actually, speaking of Freddy Krueger and his wisecracks, in the interview, Lauren was talking about how Ed Brubaker told her that serial killers in real life tend to be fond of puns. And like I said, I didn't ever watch those movies enough to know, but does Freddy Krueger, I know he makes wisecracks, does he make puns at all?
I don't remember.
It's been years.
Yeah. But I thought it was interesting because Freddy Krueger, I think there's this interesting issue of, does the killer have a motivation or not? And so we were saying, like in Scream, they're sort of motivated to emulate. They've been, their minds have been warped by watching too many horror movies. In Psycho, it's sort of psychosexual guilt or something that causes him to kill people. Freddy is trying to get back at he's taking his revenge on the kids whose parents set him on fire, who murdered him, who set him on fire. But then you have killers who just have no motivation at all, right? Like the Joker in Dark Knight Returns, who I guess he is getting money, so maybe he's disqualified from this, but he's certainly a good example of that. But also, I just watched this movie, The Strangers, and I wish they hadn't had this in the trailer, actually, but in the trailer, it's these three masked intruders assault and torment this innocent couple. And at the end, the people say, Liv Tyler, one of the victims, says, "Why are you doing this?" And one of the girls says, "Because you were home." And it's super creepy. But they had that in the trailer. And I wish they hadn't, because I think it would have been so much more interesting if you spent the whole movie wondering who these people were and what their motivation was. And then at the end you find out, like, oh, they had no motivation. They were just totally arbitrary.
Yeah, and actually that's something they say in Scream, where they're talking about how it's always scarier if the killer has no motivation, and that's how they sort of position everything. But then it actually does come out that in addition to the being warped by horror movies thing, one of the killers, Billy, he also, his girlfriend's mother had cheated on her dad with Billy's father. So, and then his mother left his father, and so he was blaming her for that. And, they'd first killed, his girlfriend Sydney's mother. And so it all started with that. But, actually it was interesting what you were saying about, serial killers making puns, because actually in Scream they do that. And that didn't even occur to me, but that's interesting if they actually did that on purpose as sort of, something to sort of possibly tip people off that guy is one of the killers. Cause so there's Billy and Stu are the two guys who collaborate to be the killers, in Scream. And Stu actually makes, a couple different puns, some like really, really terrible puns that they actually, really ham it up, when they're in those scenes. And so, almost like as if to call attention to the fact that he's, just such a dumbass, but that's interesting. I didn't actually know that these types of killers are prone to making puns, but if so, that's an interesting detail.
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy puns per se, but I do think that kind of our typical real world psycho killer, they do tend to be intelligent and articulate people, Ramirez aside. But when you look at, let's say, the Jack the Ripper letters, for being things that use almost a drug-like sense of spelling, there is a weird sense of humor behind some of the things he wrote to the police, providing, of course, Jack actually wrote those and they weren't a hoax.
I think that might be selection bias, though, because if someone's, a psychopath and they're a total dumbass, then they kill one person and they get caught, right? Like, in order to become a serial killer, you have to get away with killing a whole bunch of people. So, only the more intelligent people probably have successful serial killer careers, right?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I wonder how many people are actually like sociopathic killers who just happen to get caught after the first time.
Another movie I want to talk about is The Shining. Jack Torrance. Jack Nicholson plays Jack Torrance, who's an ordinary man who takes his family to this hotel and then goes crazy and tries to kill them. And I think it's interesting because I know Stephen King didn't like, this is an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, and I know Stephen King didn't like it because in his novel he wants you to really sympathize with Jack Torrance and see how he goes crazy over the course of the book. Whereas when you cast Jack Nicholson in the role, from the first scene you're like, this guy is effing crazy, But, there was this documentary I just watched called Room 237, where they interview people about their theories about what The Shining means. I actually didn't particularly like the documentary because the theories are so insane. But like, the one that sticks in my mind is one person thinks that Stanley Kubrick helped the government fake the moon landing video, and then he was so consumed with guilt that he confessed, and The Shining was his confession. So if you if you watch it carefully, you can see he's giving you all these hints that he was the one who faked the moon landing video.
Okay, well, that is pretty crazy. Yeah, and just for what it's worth, the Stephen King actually has a sequel to The Shining coming out this fall called Dr. Sleep.
Do you know anything? I mean, because
it's about the boy grown up.
Yeah, okay. And I guess there was another there was a TV adaptation of The Shining that was supposed to be closer to the novel, but I don't think it was very well received.
Yeah, it wasn't well received at all. I didn't see it, but I believe yes, it is much closer to the novel, but yeah, nobody seemed to like it.
All right. Well, speaking of well received, what do you guys think actually were the best? What are your favorite serial killer stories?
You like novels?
Or, movies, books, anything?
Well, I'm gonna move into books. Jim Thompson, The Killer Inside Me, is a personal favorite. It's a noir classic with a narrator unlike any I've read since, except for people trying to imitate Thompson. And really is a wonderfully unnerving story.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it would have to be, I think, Silence of the Lambs. And for me, it's the movie more than the book. I read the book later, and but the movie is always what stuck in my mind as being really great. Although I also do have a deep and abiding love for Dexter, as we've gone over in our previous episode where we talked about Dexter. But yeah, I mean, I love the whole idea of Dexter and a serial killer who hunts serial killers. I mean, obviously that's a little ridiculous on the surface, but I love the way it delves into the psychology of the killer and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I see on this list of stuff we have here, you have Kiss the Girls there, which is a novel by James Patterson. And I know that was one of the early things that I read when I was first getting into this type of book. And like Kiss the Girls, I remembered, like, I really, really enjoyed that at the time. I doubt I would enjoy it now, but I don't know if it's more of a case that my taste just matured or if James Patterson actually got actively worse as a writer, because I know I'd certainly, even back then when I was reading them, like, the book that he had come out after Kiss the Girls, I was like, I was already done with him at that point. So yeah,
well, doesn't he have like 50 books come out a week or something?
Yeah, well now it's the James Patterson Fiction Factory. I don't think it was at the time, but a lot of time I guess he comes up with the plots of things because he's good at plotting, or at least he thinks he's good at plotting, and then he's just not good at the other stuff, and so he just farms it out to other people. I'm not sure if he always does that or if he just does that sometimes, but yeah, it's the James Patterson Fiction Factory. You can actually, like, there's articles about it. He talks about it openly.
Okay, I actually have a funny Kiss the Girl story.
Sure.
So, my first couple weeks at college, I asked out this girl, and I was still sort of getting to know the neighborhood, and so I got lost driving us to the movie theater. We were going to go see some romantic comedy, and but I got on the highway going the wrong way, and it took me a while to realize it. So then I turned around, and by the time we got to the movie theater, it's like a small theater. This is up in Maine. And the movie we had intended to see, was already, we had missed it. And the only movie that was still playing was Kiss the Girls.
Mm.
And I didn't know anything about it. But we're like, well, it's the only movie. Let's go see that. And this is not a good first date movie. This story about this guy who kidnaps women and tortures them in his dungeon. So, yeah, I'm just going to say that's not I can give that an anti-recommendation as a good first date movie.
Right. So what's your favorite serial killer movie or whatever?
Yeah, I haven't really read very many serial killer books. I was going through all this stuff, my list of books on Goodreads, which is mostly fantasy and science fiction, and surprisingly few of them actually involved serial killers. Actually, in the course of researching this, I went and looked at a list which was the 45 best serial killer movies. Mm-hmm. And at the top of the list was 7, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's a great movie, and Silence of the Lambs, great movie, and Zodiac, fantastic. Mm-hmm. And then the 42 below that, I was kind of like, oh, those suck,
Uh-huh.
So yeah, certainly 7, Silence of the Lambs, and Zodiac would be my favorites. Mm-hmm. I think maybe Psycho would be up there.
Yeah, Zodiac's a great movie.
Yeah, Zodiac, we should say, is actually it's based on a true story.
Right.
It's not fiction. There's a real Zodiac, a guy called the Zodiac Killer,
and he was never captured, right?
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure he was never captured, or at least if he ever was, it was way, way, way later, after he had sort of disappeared.
Yeah, well, the movie I remember is about the investigation. The investigation stretches on for a decade or more.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure he was never captured, but it's possible that maybe some 30 years later or something they did or something. I don't remember, but.
But the thing about the movie that's just so chilling is there's this scene where there's a boyfriend and girlfriend in a park in the city, sitting beside a lake. And this guy comes up to them, who's the killer, and he shows them that he has a gun, and has this really creepy conversation with them. And this really happened she shot both of them and thought that they were dead, but the girl, I think, actually survived. And so she told the police, she recreated this whole conversation. And so in the movie, what you're hearing is what the actual conversation was from the serial killer before he, killed these 2 people, basically. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really rare that anyone would be able to tell you what a serial killer said to them before they died,
True, yeah. But I think that's one of the really fascinating things about serial killers and why we find them so interesting to write about and read about. That's the closest we can get, in real life, to an absolute monster. All the different monsters we can imagine in fantasy and science fiction and horror. It's those are cool and those are great to read about and they can be scary and whatever. But the idea that a serial killer could be out there, it's those are real things. That's the closest we really have to a monster in the world. And the idea of actually hearing what this monster was saying to people, that is pretty terrifying.
You mentioned earlier a book by a lawyer about being a functioning sociopath in society. And I've completely blanked on the name, but...
Confessions of a Sociopath.
Confessions of a Sociopath, which sounds just fascinating. It's a woman who is a lawyer who basically describes what it's like being a high-functioning sociopath in society. A sociopath's point of view. I'm a little fascinated by this concept, but I also wonder about perhaps that drive gives us our type A lawyers, politicians, those very driven people on one hand, and people with somebody chained up in the basement on the other.
Yeah, I don't know much about the book. I read a little bit about it, but it does sound interesting. If I would be very curious to check it out. But the reason I encountered it actually was Slate ran a review of it by Bret Easton Ellis, who's the author of American Psycho. But it wasn't just written by Bret Easton Ellis; it was written by him as if his character from American Psycho, Patrick Bateman, wrote the review. So it was like a psychopath reviewing this book about the inner workings of a sociopath. So it didn't necessarily make me think that, this is 100% realistic and accurate portrayal of what it's like to be a sociopath based on Bret Easton Ellis's review. But I am still kind of interested in it. I'd be curious to see what maybe just like a professional psychotherapist or something would have to say about it, like if that seems authentic and realistic. Because the person who wrote it actually wrote it under a pseudonym and stuff, and so as you would imagine, she probably would, since she wants to be a professional lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't actually read the novel American Psycho, but I think it's interesting because that was a satire, that I guess Bret Easton Ellis, his father, is some sort of business guy, and they had a very fraught relationship, and he wanted to write this book to show that working on Wall Street and being a serial killer are completely complementary pursuits, that there's no contradiction between the two. And so the character, he kills people and he's really obsessed with, actually, I'll talk about the movie, which I really enjoy. And the movie, I think, is very, very plainly satirical. But there's just like this great scene, for example, where Patrick Bateman, who's he works on Wall Street, and he takes out his new business card that he's so proud of.
Yeah.
And everyone else and his coworker is like, oh, actually, I have my new business card too. And they put down their business cards, and he's like, I can't believe that his business card is better than mine. And all the business cards looked almost exactly identical. But the fact that, this guy has some, the off-white color of one is just so, like a little bit better than his, makes him, want to kill this guy.
Yeah, I think the line from the book on that is something like, there's even a watermark.
Yeah.
That film really does capture the spirit of the book in a way that a lot of adaptations don't. And the book itself is a great ride, and I do recommend it. But the movie, it always kind of surprises me when I'm in a place like a Target or a Walmart or some mass media store, and seeing that on the shelf and knowing that something that was really kind of a transgressive book when it came out the idea has mainstreamed as much as it has, to the point that there was just recently a parody with Huey Lewis in it, recreating the Huey Lewis scene from the movie with Weird Al Yankovic.
Well, do you want to maybe explain that, Russ? What is the Huey Lewis scene in the movie?
The Huey Lewis scene, well, in the film, Patrick Bateman, as prelude to killing somebody, puts on the Huey Lewis CD Sports, and explains how it is the album itself is such a great metaphor for the 1980s, and then proceeds to murder somebody with an axe. But the weirdness of that scene resonating to the point that a parody can so cut to the heart of it really does indicate that scene works on a chilling level, and yet it's about the superficiality of popular music.
Mm-hmm. But no, you're right that my understanding is that when American Psycho, the novel, came out, I mean, a lot of people just really hated it and just really thought it was completely, sick and tasteless. I know Gloria Steinem, who's a prominent feminist, famously, criticized it. And then actually, Christian Bale is her stepson. And so then he played, Patrick Bateman in the movie. So I've always imagined that made for some interesting Thanksgiving conversation or something.
Yeah.
But then I thought it was interesting that they got a female director to do the movie.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, female directors are so rare, actually. So the fact that they actually got one to do something like this was interesting. Maybe it was sort of a way to help mitigate the damage that such a potentially misogynistic movie could do.
Well, I guess that leads into one issue I wanted to talk about, was that do movies glamorize serial killers? Lauren was talking about this a little bit in the interview, that, Hannibal Lecter and Patrick Bateman, like at one level they're horrifying, and particularly in the case of Patrick Bateman, kind of pathetic, but they're also, handsome and, well-spoken and wealthy, and, I can see a lot of people finding them appealing.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Patrick Bateman, not as much, just because, like you say, he does ultimately feel pathetic. But Hannibal Lecter, certainly. I mean, he's brilliant. And I think that's one of the things that really draws us to serial killers in general in fiction is that they're so ingenious, and they have to be to continue to get away with what they're doing. And I think we inherently find that sort of genius fascinating, whether it's evil or good. And the thing is, in order to catch the serial killer, our hero has to be fairly ingenious as well. At least most of the time. I mean, I guess sometimes it's sort of like, oh, they have a broken taillight sort of thing, and that's how they catch the serial killer. So it's like dumb luck or whatever. But, I think that's a large part of it. And so, yeah, so we almost have to glamorize them to make them a good villain. And I can certainly see, though, why people might find that troubling, since it does, that it's sort of a bad message to send.
Well, we admire rule breakers. And who's more of a rule breaker than somebody that's going around killing people? There is that sort of fascination with both the sin and the sinner. We, as a society, we like to be regulated and protected and safe. And yet, the idea of a wolf in the fold, which Jack the Ripper themed Star Trek episode title, so I dropped that into the plate. But the idea of that wolf in the fold hunting us where we're supposed to be safe really does hit on a visceral level, and it hits that fear center, but there's also this sort of weird attractiveness about it. It's, could I be that person? Is there a sexual appeal to that person? Power is an aphrodisiac, and what is more powerful than being able to end other people?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, in addition to, you guys have mentioned power and intelligence, and also I think just talent. People who are, characters who are just the best at whatever it is that they do are really appealing, like whether it's Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or whatever. Mm-hmm. But actually, John, when you said, sometimes the serial killer gets caught not through any cleverness of the detectives, that just made me think of Seven, where the killer turns himself in toward the end of the movie.
Right.
And of course, that's all part of his diabolical scheme. But it just made me think, I do want to talk a little bit more about Seven, because I think that that's a fantastic movie. I guess if you haven't seen it, basically there's a killer and he's killing people each in a way. He's targeting people who he thinks represent each of the 7 cardinal sins, and then killing them in a way that sort of punishes them for that. Okay, and so the detectives, there's Morgan Freeman, who's a very thoughtful senior detective who spends his time at the library. And then there's Brad Pitt as his kind of headstrong, flying off the handle new partner. And how they almost, and there's a funny line where, and the killer, he weaves sort of quotations at the scenes of the crime. And Brad Pitt says, just because this guy has a library card doesn't make him like Yoda or something. And I've always thought that was one of the most perfect lines at showing, just revealing character, that this is Brad Pitt's, idea of a, great thinker or whatever is Yoda. That's the only thing he can come up with. But so when he said...
Well, I was just saying, in the movie, Morgan Freeman goes and reads the books, whereas Brad Pitt goes and gets the Cliff Notes.
But so then what they do, that sort of gives Morgan Freeman the idea, if he could just see what books people are checking out of the library, maybe he could, do some data mining and identify the killer, which is, of course, massively unconstitutional. And I saw this movie with my friend Pete, who grew up in the Soviet Union, and I was trying to explain to him, no, the government can't just go and look at what library books you're reading. That's totally unconstitutional. And that's just sort of sadly ironic in retrospect, that I used to think it would be totally unimaginable for the government to be looking at what library books you're reading, where now they're actually like listening in on your phone sex just because they're bored at the NSA,
Yeah. Actually, that brings something to mind that I wanted to talk about, which was sort of how contrived a lot of these things are sometimes. And that was a case where it's like, well, that was like a cool idea, but wouldn't this guy own those books? Really? Like, he's going to check out, the Divine Comedy. Don't you think that this guy who is so obsessed with the 7 deadly sins, who is, pulling just the right quotation out to put on his murder victims, wouldn't he own the copies of those books? Would he really be going to the library? And actually, I'm not like the hugest fan of Seven. Like, I think that movie is made entirely by, or almost entirely by, the ending, which sort of forgives a lot of its sins for me.
What I like about Seven is that idea of murder as art. the various set pieces of the murders are all very artistically arranged. And I think that's one of the resonant things about that film, and that's one of the things that film does right. Compared to, there was a recent television series that tried to do literature and art and a murder called, I think it was called The Following. And I think that's already come and gone.
Mm-hmm.
But that tried to throw around the idea of a Edgar Allan Poe themed psycho killer cult that didn't resonate because, well, it appeared nobody had actually read anything by Poe. Whereas with Seven, at least the literary references work on a sort of freshman year in college level. Hey, John, have you seen Manhunter?
I have seen it. I haven't seen it since, I was probably a teenager, though, so I don't really remember it very well.
I think as any discussion of the Hannibal Lecter character, and Hopkins owned the role for so long, but, really, you got to look at Manhunter since it's the first cinematic adaptation of Red Dragon, and Brian Cox's performance, miles away from Hopkins, but is just so chilling. And for a movie that's kind of stuck in the 80s in a lot of ways, really does have some great performances and some great visuals to it. And I think as a movie, now that they've done Red Dragon in the continuity, I think a lot of people forget about Manhunter, but it's definitely one that was a big influence on me getting into this sort of the killer cinema. So.
Yeah, I remember not being particularly enthusiastic about Red Dragon, which was, the more recent adaptation of Red Dragon, and also of Hannibal, both the book and the movie. I haven't actually seen the TV show Hannibal. I don't know if either of you guys have, but I've heard that's actually good. But that's yet another person embodying the role of Hannibal Lecter now. So.
All right, well, I do want to talk about psycho killers specifically in fantasy and science fiction. I mean, obviously, Freddy and Jason are supernatural, and The Shining is a supernatural story. But do you guys have examples of real, actual fantasy and science fiction stories featuring serial killers, etc.? I mean, the only examples really I was able to come up with are, we have Sylar from the TV show Heroes, which is actually pretty cool because he's a serial killer and he kills people with superpowers and absorbs their superpowers. Like, that's a really cool idea. There's the movie Cell with Jennifer Lopez, where it's sort of it's the same idea as Roger Zelazny's He Who Shapes, that was expanded into the novel The Dream Master, where it's a psychologist who's able to go into somebody's mind, and there's sort of like weird surreal imagery to represent the mindscape of their brain, and it's not a very good movie at all, but it has amazing visuals. It was Tarsem Singh's directorial debut, and I think it's worth watching for the visuals. All this story is kind of crap. The only other examples I have on here, there's Dogface Joe from the Anubis Gates as one of my favorite characters. He's a little loose to call him like a psycho killer, but this is a guy and he's been infected with lycanthropy, right? So he turns into a werewolf, and he has the ability to swap bodies with people. But the werewolf infection always follows him wherever he goes. So he'll swap into some new body and then start growing hair and fangs and stuff and become more and more of a monster. And so then everyone's trying to kill him. So then he'll swap bodies with people. So what he'll do is he'll swap body. He'll sort of chew up his tongue so that the person can't talk, and then he'll swap bodies with an uninfected person. And then the person finds himself in the body of this monster, unable to talk, and then they get killed.
Speaking of swapping bodies, there's also the movie Fallen, which we talked about in our Demon episode. But that's about a psycho killer who swaps bodies with people. And that's one of my favorite examples.
And then I was just somebody on Twitter mentioned the Corinthian from Sandman, from Neil Gaiman's graphic novel series Sandman. And I actually just went back and reread this, and it's absolutely fantastic. This is in the second Sandman graphic novel, The Doll's House, I think it's called. And there's actually a serial killer convention at a hotel, and they've booked the whole hotel, so everyone at the whole, all the guests are all serial killers, and they show up for this convention. Of course, they don't advertise it as a serial killer convention, and it's all private. But it's funny, and you can tell that it's really funny if you go to science fiction conventions, and you can tell Neil Gaiman's obviously been to lots of science fiction conventions because just the dialogue and stuff is so spot on. And so there will be a panel like women and serial killing, and the women on the panel are like, I hate it how we're always stereotyped as either a black widow or a killer nurse, you know. and so the Corinthian is this he's sort of the supernatural killer, and he always dresses all in white and he has sunglasses. And toward the end of the arc, you see something creepy happens when he takes his sunglasses off.
One of the things that sticks with me from that story arc was that in dancing around calling them serial killers, Gaiman terms them as collectors.
Mm-hmm.
And that has just stuck in my head as one of the most interesting ways of putting it. The idea of, like any collector out there, these are just people who are, collecting a different sort of memorabilia than we are.
Yes, so for me, I mentioned Fallen. One other example that comes to mind is in my Sherlock Holmes anthology, there's a story by Tim Levin called The Horror of the Many Faces. And that's, in that one, Sherlock Holmes is pitted against this killer, that has many faces. And so it's like, that's a supernatural killer there. And, that's a really great story and quite dark. I published one in Nightmare, an original called On Murder Island by Matt Williamson. That one, so you can go read that for free online. But that one, that's a great story. It's very strange. Like originally, it was submitted to me at either Fantasy or Lightspeed, and I didn't feel like I could take it because there's not really a supernatural element. I mean, it's definitely weird. It's probably some sort of genre story. It's just that it was really hard to contextualize it as that. But then once I did Nightmare, I was like, well, it's obviously horror of some kind, and so I felt like it was okay to run there. But it's basically like, it's almost like Lord of the Flies or like The Most Dangerous Game or something. It's just like, but then like the island they're on, it's just filled with serial killers, or just other psycho killer type people. And it's a really strange story, but really, really cool. I also had a story called The Taste of Starlight by John R. Fultz that was in Lightspeed, back in 2010. And actually it was so horrifying that it was science fiction, but it was so horrifying that I actually did a whole horror issue based around it, because I was like, I can't just publish this on Lightspeed without like some context, because it was so dark that I didn't feel like it would just fly with my science fiction readers without a little context. And so that one's about a guy who's on this starship that's on its way to this distant location. And he wakes up from cryosleep, and he's going to die because he doesn't have enough provisions to get him there. And so, he becomes like a cannibal. And I'll save it for. That's a little spoilerish, but it's you can still really enjoy the descent into madness, even if you know that. And I also recently reprinted a story called God of the Razor by Joe R. Lansdale, and that one's in Nightmare, so you can go read that one online as well. But that one was also in Ross's Jack the Ripper anthology, so go ahead and you talk about that if you want, and whatever other Jack the Ripper stuff you got there.
Well, I can talk about the anthology in general, but God of the Razor is just a great story in general. And when I started putting together this anthology, I wanted to do all originals, but I needed a couple of reprints to kind of act as cornerstones and set a definition for where Jack the Ripper fiction has come from. And one that I knew I wanted to reprint, and it was Jack's Little Friend by Ramsey Campbell. And when I started talking to Joe Lansdale about it, he suggested a couple of different things. And in looking at him, God of the Razor really just drew me in. And it's just so madcap and so fun and yet so chilling. I'm glad to see it on Nightmare as well as having it in my book. But for the most part, the stories in Tales of Jack the Ripper are new stories. It's a collection of 17 stories and 2 poems. And all but 3 of the stories are brand new. I put the anthology together to mark that this year is the 125th anniversary of the Whitechapel killings. 25 years ago, 1988, we had a few Jack the Ripper anthologies come out that were really good. But I wanted to see how much things had changed in the last 25 years. And I think the authors that I've brought to this project really do capture that by looking both backward and forward at the same time. So I've got people like Sylvia Moreno Garcia in it. Ennis Drake, who's up for the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novella this year, has a short story in it. Walter Greatshell, who's always a blast to work with and just really a fun writer. T.E. Grau, Orrin Gray, Ed Kurtz, who's kind of a noir writer. Pete Rawlick, who is a Lovecraftian writer. Stanley Sargent, speaking of Lovecraftians, hasn't published any short fiction in a good 20 years, and this is one of the first new pieces he's done. So I'm really glad to have him in the book. I've got Laird Barron in the book. So really a killer collection of authors.
No pun intended.
Well, of course puns are intended. But telling
because you're a serial killer.
Now I have to kill you guys. Anyway, a killer collection of authors telling stories about really the rock star of serial killers. And I think people are going to have a lot of fun with this book.
So are the stories all science fiction and fantasy, or are any of them just like straight sort of historical sort of mysteries type things?
It's a mix. I'm a big fan of supernatural fiction. And so my aesthetic tends to bring in things like that. But there are a couple of these that exist purely in the mundane world and are more crime stories than they are fantastic stories. My main qualifier for this was not, is it fantastic? Is it sense of wonder? But is it a good story? And I was really happy with what came in.
See, and Ross, this is the first book from your new imprint, Word Horde, right? Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I started Word Horde earlier this year, and it's kind of a reaction to some of the meltdowns in publishing that have been going on over the last few years. My intention with Word Horde is to be a very upfront, communicative press, to work with authors, to pay a fair wage to authors. I paid pro rates for all the stories and tales of Jack the Ripper, and to be a little more immune from the sort of meltdowns that we've seen lately. I'm using the infrastructure that's been set up for a lot of self-publishing. I'm going through a company called Lightning Source to do printing, and I'm going through Amazon directly for the ebook versions of it. But because print-on-demand technology has gotten to the point where it looks as good as a perfect bound paperback from any manufacturer, it's the right time to do it. And that way, I'm not going to be drowning in returns like so many small presses tend to.
All right, cool. I guess another topic I wanted to bring up is just, are serial killers overdone as a topic? I mean, when John got me to watch Dexter a couple years ago, and I told him, no, I'm sorry, serial killers are just on my list along with cops, doctors, and lawyers of professions I don't watch TV shows about because I'm just bored of it. And but then he sort of talked me into watching Dexter, and I ended up loving it. But it does seem that serial killers are really overdone. I mean, if you saw the movie adaptation, there's this really funny scene where the main character Charlie is a screenwriter, and he has this sort of doofus brother who's been inspired by Charlie to work on a screenplay, and Donald is the doofus brother, and his idea for a screenplay is it's like a serial killer with multiple personality disorder, where he's the killer, the detective, and the girl, and and Charlie's just like, this is the stupidest, most cliche idea you could possibly imagine. Then of course it gets bought by Hollywood, but I guess, but I mean, like John, I was saying that actually serial killers aren't that common, at least in the fantasy and science fiction books that I've read. And it doesn't seem like you've published a ton of serial killer stories in Nightmare. Even, you're editing a horror magazine, and yet there's not that many serial killer stories that you were able to come up with. Are you getting lots of serial killer stories and you just don't like them that much, or are people not writing them as much, or what's going on with that?
Well, I can't say that I've seen a lot submitted to me. Obviously I have a team of slush readers that go through the slush, so I don't know how often they come up in the sort of lower echelons of the slush, and in the sense that, just poorly written serial killer stories. I don't know how many of those are coming in, but, I mean, I haven't really gotten a whole lot of stuff like that submitted to me, at Nightmare. But, and I mean, it is possible that I might be missing something that I didn't think of that was about a killer, but I don't think so. Although I will say that a lot of I haven't encountered a lot of supernatural or science fictional type of serial killer stories at all. And, and so, and the thing is, like, even though I am open to straight realistic stories in Nightmare, as long as they're horrific, even though I am open to that, I think a lot of writers still haven't quite got caught onto that. And so they still always, just submit supernatural horror or science fictional horror, that kind of thing, rather than, the sort of just straight horrific realistic stuff. So I don't really know, but, it could also be that it's partially like serial killer stories tend to work better in the long form. I mean, just because I know, mystery stories in general typically work better in the long form. It's harder to drop in all of the red herrings and that kind of thing that you need, you need all these diversions that the detective or whoever can go down before he catches the killer. And so it's hard to do that in a short story.
I tend to wonder anytime that we start talking about whether a movement in literature, in film, in whatever, when we start talking about it as cliche, it seems invariable that someone will shortly after you've decided it is cliche and everything's been done with this subgenre, somebody will put out something that does something new with it. And we see this happen with zombies all the time. And I think with serial killers, you get to the very simplistic TV series sort of treatment of it, which is generally kind of dumbed down, but you also get a lot of very smart treatments of it that are done in novels and do keep us coming back for more.
I will say one example on television that we haven't talked about. There's a show, Criminal Minds. That one's very, very contrived, and it's very plot driven as opposed to character driven. So it's not typically my sort of thing, but the writer Elizabeth Barrett kept talking about how great it was, and so I decided to check it out, because like when it first came out, I was like, I've seen that show 100 times, I don't need to see that, and so I didn't watch it. But then she was talking about how great it was, and so I checked it out, and I did get into it, and eventually I lost interest because it just got to be too repetitive. But one of the reasons it's so contrived, though, is just that it's like the behavioral science unit at the FBI, and so they study serial killers, but then it's like, as you were saying, Dave, it's like, both in science fiction and fantasy and in real life, serial killers are not actually that common. So, so like I said, it's very contrived because of that, but there are a lot of cool serial killers in the course of the show. Like, not everyone's like super interesting or original, but they did have a bunch of different ones that were, that felt like, oh, okay, well, that was a cool idea. And actually, one of the nice things about the show is that they do pay a lot of homage to books. Like, every episode actually begins with a quote, and they've even quoted some science fiction writers on it. It's very strange. So obviously someone on the staff is a fan, but yeah, so that's another serial killer show if you're interested. I didn't particularly care for The Following, which was the other recent one that Ross mentioned, but and like he said, I think it's already gone anyway now. So,
well, John, when you mentioned the behavioral science unit, whatever it is, I think first of all, serial killer stories lend themselves to storytelling really well, because there's like the stake that you have to do something, or else victims are going to keep turning up until you catch the person. And so anytime the story starts to drag, you can, they just found another body, and here's some more clues. But I think that the ability that we have to profile people is wildly exaggerated in movies. And the best illustration of this, I think, was that, I don't know if you guys remember, years ago, there was the DC Sniper, where somebody was shooting people with a sniper rifle at gas stations in Washington, D.C. And like all the profilers were all on the news saying like, oh, this is almost certainly a white male, age 25 to 35, like whatever. And it turned out to be like this black veteran and this like black teenage kid, and they were driving around in a car. And it was like totally, okay, that's not what you would, that's not what people were predicting at all. But what was really striking was that, and there were reports like a white van was spotted at the scene. And so everyone was like keeping an eye out for a white van. And of course I'm up in New York, so I don't expect, but just like, since that's on my mind, I'm paying attention to like, do I see a white van? And there's a white, I'll tell you, there is a white, if you drive around, I'd never noticed this before, but there is a white van in your field of view at any time if you're driving around on the street, like there's a lot of white vans out there. So, it just really gave me the impression that the profiling stuff is really exaggerated. And especially I think because there's this tendency to say that white killers are serial killers. and non-white killers, or it's like gang violence or something else that also skews the statistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's definitely something dubious about behavioral science, profiling and all that kind of stuff. It is really interesting. I mean, it could just be that, not all profilers are actually good at what they do, and it's just a really hard thing to do. I mean, I don't really understand the science of it well enough, but I do find it interesting. And so actually, so getting back to Silence of the Lambs for a minute, Scott Glenn's character in the movie, Jack Crawford, the guy who hires or brings Clarice Starling on board to go interview Hannibal Lecter, he's actually based on this guy, John Douglas, who's like the guy who really pioneered behavioral science and profiling. And so he actually wrote a book called Mindhunter, that's, sort of the first person account of a profiler, how it works, about some of his cases, about the people that he's profiled and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was interesting. But, if that's something that you're actually interested in reading more about, there is that whole book about the guy who basically pioneered the field.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that just leads into the whole issue is there like characteristic behavior or something of serial killers that would allow you to identify them just from looking at them or something? And this is sort of a personal interest to me because people often say that I seem like a serial killer just because I'm like quiet and not super animated and stuff. I'm trying to work on that for all you people who've complained about that. But, because I'm just sort of quiet and stuff. And my dad's sort of the same way. And his, it was funny because the woman that he went to senior prom with when he was in high school ended up becoming a mystery novelist. And her first novel is about a woman who goes back to her high school reunion and people are turning up dead. And like my dad read half the book. He's like, oh, I know how this is going to end. It's like the guy she went to the prom with is going to turn out to be the killer. And he was right. And so there's just, I don't know. I just want to speak out against this stereotyping of quiet, calm people. Because, I would be the worst serial killer ever. Like if I were Dexter, I would like be dumping the body parts off the boat, and I'd be like, "Oh shit, I left the head back in that room." And I think I left my wallet there too. And also, like, I can't stand to even watch like surgery performed like on ER and stuff like that. So I would be really bad at stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting question though, just because, we do like to think that we can identify these types of individuals, and I'm not sure how well we can. I mean, I think the best that we can hope to do is, for instance, if that book, Confessions of a Sociopath, if that's legit, like, I mean, if you can read something like that and actually understand how the sociopath's brain behaves, like, you can sort of probably start to pick up on some certain types of behavior, and just like in the things people say, it's like, it seems like you'd be able to notice that. Like, I mean, a lot of times you get this weird vibe about a person like that, and you just know that you don't want to spend any more time with them. Like, even if it's not really like so much as what they say, but there's something about them, like something about the way they said stuff, or something about like the look in their eye or something, like,
Well, like, I want to give a counterexample though, but you might, and this is like really disturbing. So if you ever want to sleep again, you might want to stop listening now. But when there was just a case of the three brothers who had kept those women, prisoner in their basement, and somebody had called the police at one point and said they had seen a naked woman with a leash on crawling around in the backyard, and the police kind of came and knocked on the door, and they're like, nothing here, and didn't investigate any further. And people were like, how the hell could you not investigate more in that situation? And someone posted and said, well, if you think that's bad, what do you think about this case? And actually, Jeffrey Dahmer, before he got caught, had kidnapped this teenage boy and drugged him. And somehow the boy was able to get out of the house, and he was wandering naked down the street. And these women came across him and said, who are you? Are you all right? And they called the police, and so the police show up. And then Dahmer comes out and says, oh, this is my boyfriend, and we just got drunk and had a fight. Like, let me take him home. I'll let him sleep it off. And he talked the police into and the women are like, are you crazy? And the police are like, no, it's best not to get involved in this kind of thing. Like, and they sent him off, and then Dahmer killed and ate this boy later that evening. And so, like, I mean, it seems like these police officers were just kind of oblivious, but obviously it makes you wonder, like, Dahmer must have seemed pretty normal and clean-cut and well-spoken and stuff. If he just seems like a crazy serial killer, if it was the kind of thing you could just look at someone and tell, you would think the police would have been more suspicious, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like what you were saying earlier, or what we were saying earlier about, how only the really skilled serial killers actually become serial killers because they get away with it a couple times, you know? I think that, yeah, it becomes much more unlikely that such a person would give off any actual sign that, you know, there's something wrong with them. They have to learn how to, like in Dexter, they talk about this all the time. It's like learning how to blend into society because you're this alien creature living amongst normal people.
The Dahmer story, I seem to recall that that recurs in Poppy Bright's novel Exquisite Corpse, and she elaborates on it to some degree. I mean, Dahmer was a big part of the inspiration behind that novel, and as far as dark literary rides go, I do recommend that one.
All right, cool. I guess just the last thing I have here to talk about is there are movies about psycho killers where you get the feeling that the writer is just expressing their frustration. They're like, oh, if only I could just take a gun and shoot these people that are annoying me. And that's sort of the basis of the movie. So like the movie Falling Down with Michael Douglas, where there's just like an ordinary guy and one day he just snaps and just goes around with a gun. The part that sticks in my mind is he sort of walks onto a golf course and points his gun at the rich people playing golf and says, this should be a park. Kids should be running around on this grass. Which I totally agree with, by the way. But, and then there was just this, I didn't see it, but there's this recent movie written by the comedian Bobcat Goldthwait called God Bless America, where it's basically the same idea. There's like a guy and he just snaps and goes around with a gun shooting people he doesn't like. And this sort of has a teenage girl as his accomplice. And like the first person he kills, at least the part that's shown in the trailer, is there's a girl on a reality TV show and her parents buy her a sports car for her 16th birthday, but it's the wrong kind of car. And she's like, Dad, what the fuck is wrong with you? You know? And so he goes and like kills her, you know? And so at some level, this movie is meant to, you know, the serial killer is the hero of the story, you know, or the psycho killer is the hero of the story. And I'm just wondering what your guys' impression of those kinds of stories are.
Well, they definitely fulfill a need in society. We want to punish the wicked, and we define the wicked. It's one of those traits that shows up a lot in horror movies. You know, who is that clever, wisecracking serial killer from beyond the grave stalking? Well, it's the people who are out smoking dope and having sex and you know, complaining on Twitter that they got the wrong color phone. So it is punitive, and it is cathartic. So perhaps that is why we are drawn to it.
All right, I guess, Ross, you mentioned your Jack the Ripper book. Do you have any other, what else is coming up in the future from Word Horde?
Well, Tales of Jack the Ripper will be our first release, and depending on how well it goes, I'll be figuring out what I'm doing next. But I am planning to be around and putting out cool anthologies and cool new stories for as long as I can.
All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Ross, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you.
And thanks again to Lauren Beukes for being our guest today. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Click Clack Gorilla, who writes, "My favorite podcast. A friend who knew I like Philip Pullman and Ursula Le Guin tipped me off to its existence, and I've been obsessed ever since. Working my way through the entire catalog obsessed. Listens to episodes multiple times smitten. I wish David and John would come over to my house and talk to me about sci-fi over breakfast outside of my computer. 5 stars, 10 cartwheels, 100 high fives. Just listen to it, you won't regret it. So thank you, Click Clack Gorilla. I gather from your blog that you live in Germany, so coming over to your house for breakfast might be a bit tough to arrange. But if you're ever in New York, you should definitely check out our Geeks Guide NYC Twitter feed to learn how you can meet up with me and other listeners. Also, just want to let you guys know that in July I'll be teaching for 2 weeks at the Alpha Young Writers Workshop in Pittsburgh, so our next show might be delayed a week or 2. Watch our website and Facebook page for further updates. And speaking of July, on July 28th, John and I will be taking part in SofaCon, a live online event hosted by Tony C. Smith of the Starship Sofa podcast. We'll be taking on John DiNardo and JP France of the SF Signal podcast in a no-holds-barred geek trivia smackdown. For more information, visit sofacon.org. Alright, so that was our show. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.